You see, George Bush in 1992 signed off on Agenda 21, and every president since has supported its implementation. You see, Agenda 21, in a nutshell, is about the repeal of every American's unalienable rights, including property rights. Agenda 21 focuses on lowering the standard of living of every American and, according to the document, quote, transferring resources from the United States to developing countries, end quote. It also states in the document, quote, current lifestyles of the middle class in the United States are not sustainable, and equity will be achieved through implementation of the international economic order, end quote. I'm not making it up. That's in black and white. It is verbatim from Agenda 21. And as bad as that sounds, there's some other distressing parts of Agenda 21 in black and white. They call for a 90% reduction in world population. I'm not kidding you. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not an overstatement. It's what they have in the document. So when they talk in Agenda 21 about ending the middle class in the United States, it makes sense why every president after Reagan has advocated job growth outside of the United States at the expense of the middle class in the United States. That's not hope, and that's not change. You see, in Agenda 21, they have three what they call cornerstones. The first is the abolition of property rights. That's right, abolition of private property. The second is education, specifically focused at the young folks for global citizenship. In other words, a destruction of the sovereignty of the United States and every country that signed on to Agenda 21, which is 178 countries around the world. The third cornerstone is to control and monitor human action. What do they mean by that sinister statement? And I quote, the development of public-private partnerships for the global movement of trade by the World Trade Organization. They frame it in the word smart growth. Here's what they say. This is to facilitate equalization of the United States, Mexico, and Canada through trade routes, toll roads, bridges, tunnels, and utility lines. Systems are to be developed by public-private partnerships. Governor Rick Jennifer Schneider has advocated the public-private partnership to be developed for his bridge between Michigan and Canada. We have had Dan Stamper on this show. He represents the Ambassador Bridge. They are at odds with the governor and the governor before him, Jennifer Granholm. This is why I talk about Jennifer Schneider, because Rick Schneider's policies are no different than Jennifer Granholm's in many respects. Jennifer wanted the bridge to disaster between Michigan and Canada. So does Rick Jennifer Schneider wants that same bridge. Why? Because both kneel at the altar of Agenda 21. Both are beholden to the international banking cabal. On our show, and I encourage you again to go to davejanda.com, 2 new dates, July 10th and July 23rd. Dan Stamper took the time, came to our studios, and did an hour with us about the Ambassador Bridge, the second span of bridge that they would like to build adjacent to the current Ambassador Bridge, and compared and contrasted that to Schneider's bridge to disaster. First of all, about the Detroit International Bridge Company that owns and operates the Ambassador Bridge. They have owned and operated that bridge for 30 years. Their track record is impeccable in establishing the Ambassador Bridge as the most efficient and safest border crossing in the world. And they wanted to build a second span next to their Ambassador Bridge because when they have construction on the current Ambassador Bridge, as it is getting older, they have to shut down lanes, which makes it less efficient. So at their own cost to their company, about $500 million, and zero cost to Michigan taxpayers, they wanted to build that bridge. The competing group, led by the governor, Rick Jennifer Schneider, and the government of Canada, by the way, because when you're a globalist, you just can't do things alone, right? They wanted to put up a separate bridge about a mile away at a cost between $4 and $5 billion that you will pay for. That's right. You, the overburdened taxpayer of Michigan, is going to be stuck with a huge bill. Just what you need. Just what a bankrupt state needs. But as bad as that sounded, what we exposed on this show was that Schneider's bridge was going to be built over salt mines, sinkholes, and brine wells. My dad was a civil engineer. He built skyscrapers in Chicago. One of the things he taught me is when you look at a building or a structure, whatever it is, make sure it's being built on bedrock. So I pulled the geological surveys for both bridges. The bridge the Detroit Bridge Company wanted to build next to the Ambassador Bridge would be built on bedrock, solid foundation. You can't get any better than that. When I pulled Schneider's bridge, the geological surveys, it was going to be built over salt mines, sinkholes, and brine wells. You know what? Just what we need, folks. Schneider's Bridge is another public project that soaks taxpayers and is a bridge to disaster. It's a huge problem. Part of the Detroit Bridge Company building their extension or their second span is they signed a contract with the Michigan Department of Transportation in 2004, and they signed on to do something called the Gateway Project. Construction of that actually ended up beginning in February 2008, and what it does is essentially, and when we drive downtown, if you're driving down to the car show, you'll see it, it realigns Interstate 75 and 96 to create a new entrance and exit ramps for the Ambassador Bridge, as well as Mexican Town. The Gateway Bridge project is well underway, and in fact is beyond well underway. In many respects, it's completed. The Detroit Bridge Company, the people that own the Ambassador Bridge, have spent over $100 million on that project. Over $100 million they've already spent. They bought the land. They put in new ramps, some of which have been used now for a year coming off the bridge. But as I was driving down to the car show Friday night, I saw that there were a number of large cement blocks that were put across some of the ramps so they can't be used. Well, it turns out that those ramps have been built by the Detroit Bridge Company, and they're ready to be used to decompress the traffic coming across the bridge, the truck traffic. But they can't be used. And they can't be used because the Michigan Department of Transportation has blocked the utilization of those ramps. Well, why do I bring all this up? Well, because this past Thursday, there was a trial that was held in Judge Prentice Edwards' courtroom in Detroit. And the trial really wasn't a trial. It was supposed to be a hearing where evidence was presented, witnesses were called, information was presented. The hearing, the two sides were, one, the Detroit International Bridge Company, the owner of which is Matty Maroon, and the CEO, Dan Stamper, who's been on this show. And on the other side was the Michigan Department of Transportation. So we have, and this was about the process and also the progress, or lack thereof, of the gateway portion of the construction. So we know $100 million has been spent by the Detroit International Bridge Company. We know that fuel stations have been moved, duty-free stores have been constructed, toll booths have been constructed. We know they've created ramps that have currently been in use for a year, and they've created ramps that the Michigan Department of Transportation is not allowing to be used to decompress the truck traffic coming across the bridge so that the trucks no longer have to go through neighborhoods. So at this, whatever you want to call it, I call it a goat rodeo that occurred in Judge Prentice's courtroom, he asked the Michigan Department of Transportation how things were going, and they said that there were some issues they had. And with that, without any evidence presented, any testimony, the fact the judge has not gone down to see the construction or the site, Judge Prentice held Matty Maroon, who's 84 years of age, and Dan Stamper, the CEO, in contempt of court and threw them in jail. I kid you not. This sounds like something Alex Alexeyev just talked about that's happening in Turkey. I read to you from the Toll Road News, a very well-respected national journal, and the Toll Roads Association. They said that they call it, hear no evidence, take no pleas. Prentice Edwards, the county judge, had jailed the two indefinitely this past Thursday in what we consider is a travesty of normal standards of due process and legal procedure. This same judge in December of 2011 refused to hear any evidence from the bridge company on works it had done to comply after a flurry of construction this summer and fall. He refused to visit the site. He then refused this week to allow those threatened with jail to respond to charges. They go on. Edwards, this is their words, not mine, Edwards seems to be in cahoots with State Governor Rick Schneider, who with the State Department of Transportation is pushing a rival state toll bridge at a time when traffic has gotten very small. They conclude such shenanigans were apparently too much for the State Court of Appeals. You see, the State Court of Appeals, and I want to give kudos to Judge Kurt Wilder on the State Court of Appeals, who said, quote, the bridge company lawyers had failed to make a case for their client because the case they tried to make was denied. But there nevertheless was a case. It's not often that a court of appeals will move on its own account to quash a lower court sentence. Former Michigan Speaker of the House of Representatives, Craig DeRoche, laid into this issue in an op-ed he wrote yesterday in the Detroit Free Press. Here's what he says. The Maroons were not given the chance to speak, defend themselves, or answer any charges in court. There were literally no documents or court proceedings or basis for the judge to pursue this perversion of justice or to waste tax dollars so flippantly. He goes on. For me, the most disturbing part of the whole story was the fact that the media had photos of the prison cell ready to go, implying there was no justice considered in the courtroom at all, and the media knew this in advance. The decision was made. Wrongful imprisonment and denial of federal civil rights are just part of the game, apparently, in Detroit. The judge states his reasoning for imprisonment and the taxpayers footing the costs of prison and the civil liability the state will pay is Maroon didn't respect the authority. Here's what he concludes with. I have a queasy feeling about this seemingly thuggish behavior. It's beneath our justice system and our state government to behave this way. I worry the courts will be mired for years to come with this drama instead of using precious state money, meeting our justice that is focused on improving the safety of our community. There's another organization, Windsor Square, out of Canada. Here's how they reported it. There really is a method to all this madness that has been occurring in the courtroom in Detroit. It has all been planned out with the timeliness and all, like a military project designed to shock and awe, and only governments have the power, finances, and resources to do it to their enemies without any accountability when the media has been embedded for years with the troops. The scary part to this reporter has always been if they, the governments on both sides of the border, can do what they are doing to a family with so much power and so much money, then imagine what they can do to you and me. Sure, Maroon is a billionaire, but he did it the hard way. He earned it. He wasn't given to him on a silver platter. No, he earned his money. He did it by building up his businesses and operating them. It is the American dream, after all. He lived it. And now the 1% of folks that comprise the government want to take it from him. They go on. Seriously, who is really surprised about what Judge Edwards did? Next week at an early State of the State speech in which no doubt the governor will end run the legislature, who can now stand up and oppose his actions after those nasty bridge people are in jail for contempt? I used to litigate, and I have never seen a judge make such decisions based on affidavits and without a full trial with witnesses under oath and cross-examination. He concludes, forget all this stuff. It's the hypocrisy that bothers me. You will see it over and over the next few days. Crocodile tears at first from the media types, then the columnists, as then they launch into a tirade, slamming the Maroon family, calling them every name under the sun. It will carry on constantly building up to the governor's State of the State speech. It will be well-orchestrated propaganda effort. There is a real purpose behind all of this. The bottom line, they want to convince Maroon to sell out and sell out now, but before the family gets in worse trouble. Yeah, that's what this has come down to, folks. You see, the governor, Rick Jennifer Schneider, lost in the legislature when the Senate said no to him. The public said no to the nerd again. By a tune of over 70% of Michiganders said no to the bridge to disaster. So when he couldn't get his way, he unleashed the judicial system on him. We all think of Lady Justice, blindfolded for impartiality, holding those scales for truth and fairness. Here's how Dave Jandal looks at it. Lady Justice is a scam. That blindfold, she's blindfolded to the truth. And what those scales are for, they're there to figure out who's paying what so she can make that decision go the way the biggest bidder pays. You see, what happened in that courtroom was a travesty to the Constitution. Yeah, it was bad for Maroon. It was bad for Stamper. It was bad for the bridge company, but it was worse for this country. It was worse for the legal system. It is worse for our future. Oh, there's one other thing you need to know before I sign off. In November, Judge Rick Jennifer Schneider appointed Prentice Edwards' son, you know, the judge that ruled on this case. Rick Jennifer Schneider appointed the son to become a judge also. To me, a kid who grew up in Chicago, this beyond smells. It beyond stinks. I close with Henry Bastiat. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men living together in society, they create for themselves, in the course of time, a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Proud of yourself, Rick Jennifer? I'm sure not proud of you as our governor. Folks, you're listening to Operation Freedom. We're here every Sunday from 3 to 5. Remember, it's time to dream big and dare.